They sealed thousands of Tartarian temples after 1800, but why hide the power that built them? There is a map sitting in the archive of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, printed in Paris in 1706, that should make every historian pause. It is a map of the known world, finely engraved on copper plate, colored in the soft ochres and sage greens of the period. And there, stretching from the eastern banks of the Volga River all the way to the Pacific coast of the Asian continent, is a single, enormous political entity, labeled in elegant serif lettering as Grand Tartary. It is not a vague geographic description, the way you might label a desert or an ocean. It has borders. It has subdivisions. It has named regions: Tartary Independent, Tartary Chinoise, Tartary Muscovite. Some editions give it a flag. Some give it a sovereign. And then, within the span of roughly a century, it vanishes entirely from the maps of the world, replaced by the expanding territories of the Russian Empire to the north and the Qing dynasty to the east, as though 30 million square kilometers of organized civilization simply exhaled and disappeared. This alone is a mystery worth sitting with. Empires do not evaporate. Populations do not dissolve. Roads and cities and temples do not unmake themselves. Yet when you look for the monuments of Grand Tartary, when you search for the physical fingerprint of the civilization in the landscape of Central Asia, the Siberian plains, and the high steppes between the Ural Mountains and the Altai Range, the official historical record offers you almost nothing. It offers you nomads. It offers you yurts. It offers you a pre-modern emptiness. But the maps say otherwise. And the buildings, the ones still standing today in cities that were supposedly founded by Russian colonists in the 18th and 19th centuries, the buildings say something else entirely. To understand the full weight of what we are exploring in this video, you need to hold two facts in your mind simultaneously. The first is that cartographers of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, men like Jodocus Hondius, whose atlas editions of the early 1600s were considered the most authoritative geographical works in Europe, and Petrus Bertius, the cosmographer to the French king, consistently drew and labeled Tartaria as a functioning political and cultural reality. These were not idle speculators. These were royal cartographers, men whose work was purchased by governments and navies for the purpose of navigation and military strategy. They did not invent nations. They recorded them. The second fact is that the first edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, published between 1768 and 1771 in Edinburgh, devotes a substantial entry to Tartary, describing it as a vast country in the northern parts of Asia, bounded by Siberia to the north and west, and noting its various peoples and provinces with the same matter-of-fact precision it applied to France or England. This encyclopedia was the crowning intellectual achievement of the Scottish Enlightenment. It did not deal in fairy tales. So the question is not whether Tartaria existed as a recognized geopolitical reality in the minds of the most educated people in Europe for nearly 300 years. Clearly did. The question is what happened to it, and more urgently, why does the physical evidence of its civilization appear to have been deliberately sealed, reclassified, or demolished beginning in the early 19th century? This is where the architecture begins to speak. There is a phenomenon that researchers who study this subject have come to call the mud flood theory, and while that name carries the weight of the unconventional, the visual evidence it points toward is genuinely difficult to explain away. If you walk through the older districts of cities like Kazan, Tomsk, or Omsk in western Siberia, cities that official history tells us were rough frontier outposts or modest trading towns before the 19th century, you will notice something strange about many of the older stone and brick buildings that still survive. Their windows begin at street level or even below it. Their lower stories are partially or wholly submerged beneath the current ground. The doors of some older structures open onto what is now the second floor. The basements, when they can be accessed, have ceilings of full height and elaborate stone or brick detailing that you would not lavish on a subterranean storage room. In some cases, the arched windows visible just above the current pavement line are bricked up, sealed from the outside, as though someone filled the surrounding earth up to the sill and simply buried the lower register of these buildings rather than demolish them entirely. The official explanation, when one is offered at all, tends to cite accumulated street sediment over centuries, gradual urban landfill, or deliberate raising of ground level to address flooding or sanitation concerns. These are reasonable explanations in isolation. But when the same pattern appears in dozens of cities across a geographic range spanning from Central Europe to the American Midwest, when you find the same half-buried architectural profile in St. Petersburg, in Philadelphia, in Chicago's older districts, and in the frontier towns of New South Wales, the coincidence begins to strain. The question stops being about sediment accumulation and starts being about a common event or a common act of burial applied to the remnants of a world that preceded the one we were taught began in the early 1800s. What makes the sealed temples at the heart of this video's title so extraordinary is not just their submersion. It is their design, because throughout the regions once labeled as Tartaria on European maps, and in the cities of the Western world that supposedly grew from colonial scratch in the 19th century, there is an overwhelming prevalence of a specific architectural vocabulary. Domes, colonnades, spires, acoustic resonating chambers built with vaulted ceilings and precisely calibrated proportions. The use of red brick combined with white stone detailing, mercury gilding on exterior metalwork, and most strikingly, the widespread adoption of the star fort, or what military historians call the Tres Italienne, a design featuring enormous angular bastions projecting outward from a central keep, creating a star-shaped footprint that is visible from above and deeply disorienting to any attacking force at ground level. The official history of star forts places their invention firmly in Renaissance Italy, a response to the development of cannon artillery in the 15th century. The angled walls deflect cannonballs rather than absorbing their impact the way medieval vertical walls did. This is a functional, logical explanation, but the sheer global distribution of this design, appearing not only in the strategic ports and border towns of Europe where their military utility is obvious, but in the interiors of continents, in places like the American Midwest, in sub-Saharan Africa, in locations that faced no artillery threat in any documented military history, suggests that their construction was driven by something more than or other than purely military calculation. Some researchers who study this architectural anomaly propose that the star fort's geometry, when understood not as a military layout but as an energy layout, creates a radial field around a central point, and that the specific proportions of the bastions, the moat dimensions, and the relationship between the central tower and the outer walls mirror the design principles that appear in other structures we classify as temples, cathedrals, and public halls of the Old World. Here is where the theory of Antiquitech enters the conversation. The proposition, held by a growing community of independent researchers and architectural historians who operate outside academic institutions, is that the civilization we are calling Tartarian, or the global predecessor civilization it represents, understood and applied principles of resonant energy that our current physics does not formally recognize, but that our bodies and our instruments occasionally register. The great cathedrals of Europe, so much of whose foundational stonework predates the official founding dates attached to them by centuries, were not merely houses of worship. They were, according to this theory, precision acoustic instruments. The specific mineral composition of their stone, the integration of quartz-bearing granite in their foundations, the placement of their spires at precise angles relative to underground water sources and geomagnetic lines, the use of specific proportions in their nave widths and vault heights, all of this was intentional technology. The hum that sensitive visitors sometimes report in certain ancient churches is not imagination. It is measurable. And the tradition of placing a central spire or dome at the highest point of a settlement, a tradition that appears in cultures as geographically separated as the temples of Tartaria's Central Asian heartland, the mosque complexes of Samarkand, the civic domes of North American cities, and the pagodas of East Asia, suggests that this knowledge of vertical energetic architecture was not invented independently by each culture. It was inherited, This is the point at which the sealing of these temples becomes deeply meaningful. Because if these structures were functional technology, if their domes and spires and underground chambers were designed to collect, amplify, and distribute some form of ambient atmospheric or telluric energy to the surrounding population, then the deliberate decommissioning of these buildings is not an act of urban development. It is an act of disconnection. It is the cutting of a wire. And the timing of this disconnection, concentrated in the decades following the Napoleonic Wars and accelerating through the mid-19th century, coincides precisely with the period during which the new industrial economy, based on coal, steam, and privately controlled energy distribution, was establishing itself as the dominant global paradigm. The question of who the Tartarians were, who actually lived and built within this vast empire of the maps, is one that conventional ethnography handles with the blunt instrument of generalization. The peoples of Central Asia, the steppe cultures, the Turkic and Mongolian and Persian-speaking confederations are presented as pastoral and nomadic, as fundamentally non-architectural in their civilization. Yet the ruins of Merv, once one of the largest cities on Earth and a jewel of the Silk Road, whose foundations cover an area of roughly 1,000 square kilometers in what is now Turkmenistan, tell a different story. The ruins of Otrar, whose library was reportedly one of the greatest in the medieval world before the Mongol invasion. The city of Samarkand itself, whose Registan complex features tilework and geometric precision that staggers contemporary engineers, and whose construction the official record attributes to the Timurid dynasty of the 14th and 15th centuries, but whose foundational geometry appears to belong to an earlier and less credited tradition. These are not the ruins of nomads. These are the ruins of a civilization that understood mathematics, astronomy, acoustics, and urban planning at a level that embarrasses the sparse narrative we have been given about the pre-Columbian, pre-industrial world. The Great Reset, as researchers in this field have come to call the period of erasure that followed the consolidation of the Russian and British empires into the former territories of Tartaria, was not necessarily a single event. It appears to have been a process carried out over several decades, combining several mechanisms. First, the rewriting and standardization of historical records, the process by which local oral traditions, dynastic chronicles, and religious texts that preserved the memory of the old civilization were either confiscated, reclassified, or simply replaced by the new colonial administrative histories. Second, the physical transformation of existing architecture, the sealing of lower floors that contained the energetic infrastructure, the addition of new facades to old buildings to claim them as new constructions, the demolition of towers and spires that the new order had no use for and perhaps reason to fear. And third, the repopulation of the landscape with a new kind of human subject, one educated from birth in the schools of the industrialist world, one for whom the old buildings were simply picturesque relics, curiosities of a barbaric past, rather than functional monuments of a sophisticated civilization. The orphan trains of the 19th century, those strange and sad convoys of homeless children transported across the United States and placed with frontier families between roughly 1854 and 1929, have been cited by some researchers as a possible echo of this repopulation process. The official explanation is humanitarian, and it may well be, but the scale of the program, roughly 250,000 children relocated to fill the demographic gaps of a supposedly newly settled continent, raises questions about who these children were and where they originally came from. What remains for us today, those of us who look at our cities with newly questioning eyes, is the architecture itself. The buildings that were too large to demolish, too beautiful to fully obscure, too structurally remarkable to quietly bury. The star forts that now serve as public parks and tourist attractions in cities from Palmanova in Italy to Fort Monroe in Virginia. The civic buildings of 19th century American cities that were supposedly constructed in months by immigrant laborers and horse-drawn equipment, but whose stonework and proportional sophistication rival anything built by the acknowledged great civilizations of antiquity. The train stations that look like cathedrals, the post offices that look like palaces, the courthouses that look like temples, all built within a supposedly utilitarian industrial era by a civilization that, according to the official record, had only recently emerged from frontier roughness. These buildings are sealed temples too, in their own way. Their original purpose, whatever resonant or energetic or civic spiritual function they may have served, has been reclassified. They are now bureaucratic containers. Their domes no longer hum with intended purpose. Their spires no longer connect, but they stand and they endure, and they continue to ask their silent question of everyone who passes beneath them. That question is the one this channel exists to ask alongside you. Not to tell you that everything you were taught is a lie, because the truth is almost certainly more layered and more human than any single theory of suppression can contain. But to suggest that the map we were given of our own past is incomplete. That somewhere beneath the sediment of official history, at the depth of a buried window or the silence of a sealed basement door, the fingerprints of a more complex world are waiting for us to look closely enough to find them. Look at the buildings in your own city. Look at the proportions of the domes. Look at the way the oldest structures sit in relation to the ground. Look for the windows that begin too low. Because once you start to see the pattern, it becomes very difficult to stop seeing it. And that, perhaps, is exactly where the Real investigation begins.